Okay, I think we can start. Well, it's my pleasure and honor to present today Professor Carrie Nederman, who is a professor of political science at Texas A&M University. And Professor Nederman is author of many books and journal articles, and his books are mainly on the ancient and medieval political thought, or the political thought until the 17th century, including his book, The Bonds of Humanity, Legacies of Ciceronian Social and Political Thought in Middle Ages and Early Modernity. Also, he's an author of a biography of Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, and he edited a companion to Marsiglius of Padua for Brill in 2011. And today, Professor Nederman will talk about Marsiglius of Padua and his work Defensor Pacis. So, Professor Nederman, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity to be able to speak to this group and this project. In fact, was a wonderful opportunity because I had gone back and thought about some things, or started to think about some things that I hadn't considered before. I've been reading the Defensor Pacis since I was an undergraduate many decades ago, and I'm always amazed when I go back and have the opportunity to ask another question, how much I see that I had not picked up on before. It's a work that keeps on giving. Well, okay, without further introduction, then let me begin to present my talk. Within the political lexicon of the European Middle Ages, tyranny, along with related terms such as tyrant and tyrannical, constituted one of its most ubiquitous and flexibly applied discursive fields. As Mario Torchetti amply demonstrated in his magisterial survey of ideas of tyranny and tyrannicide from antiquity to recent times, the major and certainly many minor political theorists writing between the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the 15th century were concerned about, and in some instances obsessed with, the conduct of tyrants and tyrannical governments. Although ordinarily pejorative in its overtones, however, the deployment of tyranny language, let alone its meaning, was by no means uniform. For some authors, tyrants, as the servants of God, performed a salutary didactic function for the people subjected to them. According to others, tyranny was a scourge and an affront to divine law that men had a duty to root out whenever and wherever it began to flower. Yet another group of thinkers expressed mixed judgments about tyrannies, inasmuch as how we ought to regard them depended on contextual factors of various sorts, such as the identity of the tyrannized parties, the locale in which the tyranny was exercised, and the relative merits and demerits of the individuals accused of tyrannical behavior. Likewise, the sources for theoretically informed discussions of tyranny were quite diverse, ranging from patristic and early medieval texts by St. Gregory the Great and Isidore of Seville, to pre-Christian classical writings such as Cicero's De Officiis, and later on Aristotle's Ethics and Politics, once they had begun to circulate in the West after their translation into Latin in the mid-1200s. One of the most highly regarded political theorists of the late Middle Ages has not figured very prominently in the scholarly narrative about the discourses of tyranny that were propagated during the Middle Ages, namely Marsiglio, otherwise known as Marsiglius of Padua, an implacable opponent of papal power who is often invoked as a founding figure in the cause of secularism. In June 1324, it will be 700 years come next June, Marsiglio completed his masterwork, the Defensor Pacis, a lengthy rebuke and refutation, girded in Aristotelian authority, of claims made on behalf of the Pope to universal domination over earthly human affairs. Although Turchetti includes a 2.5-page section on Marsilio in his survey, he does not quote a single passage from the Defensor Pacis in which the word tyrannus or related terminology is to be found. Moreover, one searches in vain through the standard secondary scholarship on Marsilio to locate any sustained discussion of tyranny as a concept deserving of attention. There may be a perfectly good reason scholars have said little about how tyranny plays a role in the Defensor Pacis. Namely, Marsilio himself barely addresses it there, at least in comparison with his fellow scholastic philosophers, as well as with the numerous polemical contributors to the early 14th century debates about the respective powers of secular and spiritual authorities. Even though the Defensor Pacis is a treatise of considerable girth, 613 pages in Schultz's critical edition, one finds only 17 uses of tyranny language, all but 2 of which are located in its first discourse, relatively brief treatment of the foundations of secular government. 5 of these are contained in direct quotes from William of Moerbeck's Latin translation of the Politics, while another 7 of them purport to cite specific sections of Aristotle's text. At face value, this would seem to afford an archetypical illustration of Marsilio's deep affinity for and identification with Aristotelian political philosophy, affording one further piece of evidence supporting the conclusion that had been already drawn in the 16th century that he was a man more Aristotelian than Christian. Of course, the extent of Marsilio's actual commitment to Aristotelianism is a subject that has been much debated in recent times. But he seems to hew closely to the conventional 6-fold Aristotelian classification of constitutional systems into royal monarchy or kingship, aristocracy, polity, that is to say the 3 just forms of government, and tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, the unjust types. The relative dearth of references in the Defensor Pacis to tyranny may appear all the more striking since the accusation of tyrannical conduct would seem to offer such a convenient bolt for Marsilio to hurl at his arch nemesis, Pope John XXII. Should he have done so, he would not have been alone. A few years after the Defensor Pacis was finished, Marsilio's comrade in anti-papal ecclesio-political polemics, William of Ockham, produced an entire treatise devoted to condemning, quote, the wickedness of those supreme pontiffs who tried to rule like tyrants, unquote. And I note that there was discussion that Sylvain Perron had discussed this topic in his presentation. So people who had heard that would have been familiar, should have been familiar with it or will be familiar with it. Given that Marsilio never pulled rhetorical punches when it came to challenging the papacy, it seems odd that only once in the Defensor Pacis does he associate the papal office with tyranny. And even that instance is somewhat peculiar. In the much longer second discourse of the Defensor Pacis, Marsilio bemoans the papacy's misuse of the temporal goods of the church, which ought to be devoted to the support of its ministers and of members of the laity in material need. Instead, he complains, quote, most temporal goods are consumed by mercenary soldiers, cavalry, and infantry in order to foment and nourish wars among faithful Christians, so that the pontiffs may ultimately be able to subject them to their tyrannical power. Tyranny potestati. In view of the context in which this passage occurs, it's difficult to know what to make of it. The rest of the chapter focuses entirely on how the popes attempt to exercise an alleged plenitude of power over the internal organization of the church, specifically through the assignment of benefices and the appointment of clerical officials, ruins the fabric of its mystical body. He actually uses the language of mystical body there, to the point of near death. Certainly, Marsilio opens no doors for his reader to conclude that the papal plenitude of power may be conceived as a version of tyranny, which is precisely the position that Occam and other contemporary opponents of the Pope's temporal aspirations asserted. At best, one might infer that the Pope's actions may specifically be labeled tyrannical when they involve him in paying for and commanding military resources in order to pursue by means of direct action his goals of earthly dominion. There are a couple of other instances in the Defensor Patres in which tyranny is invoked in rather sui generis fashion. In the opening book of the first discourse, Marsiglio complains about the miserable conditions under which Italy suffers in his own times. The theme is not uncommon. It will be repeated by many times over by Italian political authors, all the way down to Machiavelli. Italy was once in ancient days united and peaceful, so this trope goes, as a result of which the Italian people, quote, brought the whole habitable world under their sway, unquote. But just as discord led to the downfall of the great Italian empire of the past, that is Rome, so more recently, quote, Italy is once again battered on all sides because of strife, and the Italian natives are deprived of the sufficient life, talk about that theme moving forward, are deprived of the sufficient life, undergoing the greatest hardships instead of the quiet they seek, and harsh yoke of tyrants instead of liberty, unquote. Quentin Skinner has used the latter clause to associate Marsiglio with other Italian thinkers of the 14th century, such as Ptolemy of Lucca and Bartolus of Sassoferrato, as a spirited proponent of republicanism against tyrannical rule in a manner that presaged Renaissance civic humanism. But this is the sole passage in the Defensor Patres that contraposes tyranny language to liberty in this way. Rather, in view of Marsiglio's overarching agenda of opposing the threat posed by papal intrusions into European temporal governments generally, his momentary allusion to the situation in Italy seems intended more as a rhetorical device than the expression of a patriotic commitment. His message is, in essence, look, if the papacy can stir up so much trouble and create such opportunities for tyrannical misrule among a people that once dominated the world, imagine what it can do elsewhere throughout Christendom. This is entirely in line with the project that animates the leading argument of the Defensor Patres. Another somewhat singular reliance on tyranny language in Marsiglio's text may be located in the only other occurrence of it in the second discourse of the Defensor Patres. Chapter 25 addresses the issue of how popes have illegitimately sought to extend their supposedly plenitudinous power into the realm of secular affairs. He's quite specific about the incursions that popes have made into the imperial jurisdictions of major European cities, among which he cites Ferrara, Romagna, and Bologna, by means of episcopal appointments without the assent of the emperor. This leads him to present a compressed account of the investiture controversy and its supposed resolution in favor of the papacy, drawing explicitly on Martinus Polonus as his source. When subsequent Roman emperors, Marsiglio identifies Otto IV and Frederick II by name, attempted to negate the terms of agreement and restore their rights to invest, quote, bishops, abbots, and other clergymen, they were made objects of many conspiracies, persecutions, and harassments by the Roman bishops and clergy, unquote. Responsibility for their failure to accomplish the same, Marsiglio explains at least partially on the fact that, quote, the people subject to them gave them little help, unquote. Why? He goes on, perhaps because they or their ministers or officials were sometimes known to be tyrannical, unquote. Considering Marsiglio's own advocacy of the cause of King Ludwig of Bavaria in his seeking to be crowned emperor, Ludwig was the dedicatee of the Defensor Patres. The suggestion that any recent emperor might validly be accused of tyranny ought to raise eyebrows. Nonetheless, Marsiglio seems unfazed. Thus far, one might infer that the theme of tyranny in the Defensor Patres does not offer a very promising avenue for enhancing our appreciation of Marsiglio's political thought. And I have to say that was as I was working back through the text, again, to thinking about tyranny, that was my initial impression was, I'm not so sure that there's much there. It turns out this isn't the case, however, as I investigated further. To understand why, it's necessary to revisit his adaptation of Aristotle's definition of a tyrannical regime. In Politics 1279b, 5 through 9, tyranny is identified by Aristotle as, quote, monarchy for the advantage of the monarch and not for the common profit, unquote. Marsiglio proffers a definition of tyranny that is more robust. He describes tyranny as, quote, an infected government. It's infected there is viatus, an infected government in which one man is dominating for his own benefit, contrary to the will of subjects. This reflects a distinction he draws between two genera of regimes: those he calls well-tempered, in which the ruler governs for the common benefit in accordance with the will of subjects, and those he terms infected, in which those qualities are deficient or defective. The nomenclature itself reflects Marsiglio's penchant for adjusting medical language and concepts to suit his political theory, doubtless a reflection of his own training as a physician. Tyranny is then a sort of illness that afflicts governments organized monarchically. As in the case of Aristotle, Marsiglio posits that the tyrant serves himself only and not the common advantage. But the way in which the Defensor Pacis conceives of that advantage is unprecedented. The measure of benefit is referred to the volition of the populace over whom rulership is exercised. According to Marsiglio, quote, monarchy participates so much the more in tyranny, the more it diverges from the consent of subjects and law established for their common benefit, unquote. Although he attempts to ground this claim on the authority of Aristotle, specifically Politics 1295a15, his appeal is entirely unconvincing. Marsiglio steps beyond the boundary lines demarcating Aristotelian territory. Another noteworthy departure from Aristotle is to be found in the Defensor Pacis, arises from the way in which Marsiglio handles the issue of judging which among the infected forms of government should be regarded as the worst. Medieval readers of the Politics conventionally followed Aristotle by proposing such evaluative distinctions between constitutions, not only classifying the good versus the evil ones, as Marsiglio does, but also discerning which of the several systems that fall into each category should be preferred or especially avoided. By contrast, Marsiglio expressly declines to engage in this manner of assessment. Quote, as for saying which of the temperate governments is best or which of the infected ones is worst, the relative goodness or badness of the other ones, this is not a matter for present consideration, unquote. He then refers his reader back to what Aristotle says about the topic without further explanation. In the following chapter of the Defensor Pacis, he reiterates his agnosticism regarding how to estimate the merits of various constitutional arrangements, remarking that, quote, in all these questions, there's room for inquiry and reasonable doubt, unquote. Now, however, it becomes evident why Marsiglio refrains from offering his own judgment. His sole concern is to establish that, quote, election is the more certain standard of government, unquote. In other words, the establishment of well-tempered governments reliably occurs by means of elections, whereas, quote, infected governments are usually instituted by force or fraud or both, unquote. Simply stated, quote, it is the consent of subjects, either absolutely or to a greater degree, which is the distinguishing criterion for delineating between healthy and diseased regimes. Although Marsiglio once more attempts to justify his adoption of this position by asserting that it reflects, quote, the manifest view of Aristotle, unquote, the attribution again falls flat. By insisting that a single concrete standard for determining whether a regime counts as serving the common welfare or not, namely the voluntary character of the government and the laws, he profoundly modifies the Aristotelian conception of tyranny. In order to comprehend the significance of Marsiglio's variance from his alleged source in the ways I've identified, It is necessary to examine his requirement that those party to a political community, whether we label them subjects or citizens, he uses those terms more or less indistinguishably, must extend their consent. Let me read that again. It's necessary to examine his requirement that those party to a political community must extend their consent. First, all whose interests are served or affected by a community must be conceded full membership in it, which is manifested by their agreement to the conditions of association, that is, law and rulership. Secondly, having so consented, all such citizens are absolutely bound to obey the law and the determinations made by rulers in accordance with it. In other words, people must individually as well as collectively submit to the terms of their cooperation, after which they can be held strictly accountable for actions they may commit detrimental to the advantage of their fellow citizens. As a consequence, the Defensor Pacis holds that the legitimacy of both laws and rulers depends wholly upon the extent to which those subject to their jurisdiction have publicly and overtly consented to their authority. Every matter, quote, whose proper institution is of the greatest importance for the communal sufficiency of citizens in this life, and whose depraved institution impends communal detriment, must be instituted only by the whole body of citizens, unquote. This entails for Marsiglio not merely formal corporative assent, but an extensive privilege on the part of each individual member of the community to reserve to himself alone final judgment about matters of public regulation. Marsiglio stipulates the indispensability of consent because a government's very legitimacy depends on its congruence with the voluntary acquiescence of those over whom it rules. And the only way to ensure such congruence is by a prior act of explicit consent on the part of citizens. Hence, Marsiglio asserts that no one can protest against the enforcement of a law which that person has already approved. In turn, Marsiglio's conception of consent rests on a principle of human nature that enshrines temporal advantage as a fundamental and entirely legitimate goal of human conduct. Indeed, he establishes as his, quote, starting point that all human beings not deformed or naturally, otherwise impeded naturally, desire a sufficient life and avoid or flee what is harmful thereto, which has been acknowledged not only with regard to humanity, but with regard to every genus of animal, unquote. The advantage of human beings is achieved by gaining those conditions of existence which confer upon them a physically adequate life. Marsiglio makes a passing mention, although Marsiglio makes passing mention of the Aristotelian conception of a higher good life, constituted by the exercise of the practical and theoretical virtues, material sufficiency receives the overwhelming measure of his attention. Since temporal satisfaction forms Marsiglio's operative principle in the argument in Defensor Pacis, he contends that human beings invariably prioritize their own good. Quote, everyone is prone to pursue one's own advantage, the Latin there is commodum, and to avoid what is disadvantageous, incommodum. Marsiglio judges this to be a natural and unavoidable condition of physical existence, rather than advice to be condemned and reviled. The pursuit of personal advantage follows directly, in fact, from the principle of self-preservation. Since we are enjoined by nature to preserve our material existence, it is entirely unnatural for us to undertake any action that would injure or disadvantage ourselves. This seems to be the rationale behind Marsiglio's striking insistence that, quote, no one knowingly harms or wills injustice to oneself, unquote. If human beings could live in isolation, and if their activities were entirely self-directed, it would be unnecessary to set limits on behavior, since each person looking out for himself is best qualified to determine what is required for self-preservation. But Marsiglio recognizes that the self-interest of individuals is achieved most fully and naturally under conditions of human cooperation in the context of an ordered and organized community. Marsiglio holds that, quote, human beings came together in the civil community in order to pursue advantage and a sufficient life and to avoid the opposite. The claim that human beings associate primarily on account of self-interest grounds the account of the origins of communal life in the Defensor Patris. What he terms the perfected community emerges from the differentiation of the functions necessary for a materially sufficient existence. These tasks being defined by the various arts created by men in order to redress their physical infirmities. The human creature, Marsiglio observes, quote, needs arts of diverse genera and species to avoid the aforementioned harms, unquote. Given their infirmities, quote, it was necessary for human beings to assemble together to obtain advantage from these arts and to avoid disadvantage, unquote. Marsiglio thus posits that the commission of acts that impact others in the context of a communal setting is absolutely necessary for human beings to attain a sufficient life. The perfected human association, civil association, requires, quote, the mutual association of citizens, their intercommunication of their functions with one another, their mutual aid and assistance, and in general, the power, unimpeded from without, of exercising their particular and common functions, and also the participation in common benefits and burdens according to the measure appropriate to each, unquote. The occupations necessary for achieving a sufficient temporal life, including farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and warriors, make valuable, indeed necessary, contributions to the community. The purpose of law and government follows directly from these factors. Marsiglio acknowledges that it is entirely possible that people, by seeking their own benefit, may harm others, whether intentionally or not. Human actions, he observes, quote, can be done for the advantage or the disadvantage or injury of a person other than the agent for the sake of one's condition in the present life, unquote. The problem is, of course, that should human beings seek their own interests at the expense of their fellows, conflicts would readily emerge within the community. Thus, the exercise of coercive power is necessary in order to ensure that people, in the pursuit of their own material advantage, do not injure one another and consequently damage or destroy the very relationships that render the sufficient life that they naturally desire. Here we encounter Marsiglio's central preoccupation in the Defensor Patris, the maintenance of civil peace. In the opening sentence of the text, he allows, quote, the advantages and fruits of the tranquility or peace of civil regimes, chief among which is the sufficient life which no one can obtain without peace and tranquility, unquote. Peace for Marsiglio is not an end in itself, but a requirement for the realization of stable intercourse within the community toward the end of a materially satisfactory life. Whatever threatens the peace is necessarily inconsistent with the natural and proper goal of human society. Hence, there must be a common standard of public conduct, that is to say, the law, as well as a mechanism for its enforcement, that is, government. Now, a reasonable question remains. According to what criteria, what point of reference, should the worthiness of legislative measures and candidates for rulership be determined? Most medieval thinkers would generally have responded that the selection of laws and rulers depends on right reason, or natural justice, or divine inspiration in order to reach the correct decisions. The wisest, or most virtuous, or most holy were best qualified to promulgate legislation and to appoint rulers. Marsiglio, of course, cannot abide this, not least because it potentially positions the priesthood to interfere with or even monopolize the process of decision-making within the secular community. The problem is rooted in the self-interested character of human beings. The act of authorizing laws or selecting rulers cannot, Marsiglio insists, be left to any segment of the communal body, any segment, to decide for the whole. To do so creates opportunities for serious abuse in his view. Quote, it would be insecure to entrust the making of the law to the discretion of the few, for they would perhaps consult therein their own private benefit as individuals or as a group rather than the common benefit, as is quite clear in those who have made the decretals of the clergy, unquote. Left to their own devices, in other words, people occupying positions of power will quite naturally and unavoidably create laws and make decisions that favor themselves. Behind claims to moral, intellectual, or spiritual superiority that drive the view that the many should defer to the few, Marsiglio detects the possibility of naked self-interest intruding into the political process in such a way as to favor those who hold power. This point directly informs his conception of tyranny in turn. Should a single person be endowed with the prerogative to promulgate law according to his own will, quote, through ignorance or malice or both, this one man could make a depraved law, namely looking more to private than to common benefit, so that it would be tyrannical, unquote. Consequently, he concludes, quote, when the power to make the laws is given to one man alone, the opportunity is afforded for tyranny, unquote. Marsiglio evidently regards this outcome as inevitable, since even in the case of, quote, the best man, optimo viro, it ought to be considered that, that every soul has evil dispositions. No one, however virtuous, can be so lacking in perverted passion and ignorance as is the law, unquote. The reason Marsiglio believes this to be so pertains to the consensual source of law, inasmuch as he maintains that no single person or group can, quote, discern or desire the common benefit equally as well as with the entire multitude of citizens, unquote. Thus, the only reliable way to deter such behavior is to insist on broadly based consent, the terms of which are not moral reason or spiritual illumination, but direct impact upon one's own advantage. Every person correctly and adequately evaluates laws and rulers when he measures them against the yardstick of self-interest. Marsiglio asserts, quote, those matters, therefore, that can touch on the advantage or disadvantage of everyone ought to be known and heard by everyone so that they can obtain advantage and repel its opposite, unquote. Citizens must be accorded a role in consent to law and government, inasmuch as statutory dictates and execution of them impact on their direct interests. No power may legitimately impose its will upon the community through the establishment and enforcement of depraved laws in a manner inconsistent with the interests of citizens, where again such interest is understood in terms of the value of a sufficient life. Therefore, by consulting one's own direct benefit in the evaluation of public affairs, one simultaneously discovers the communal benefit. Quote, the common utility of a law is better noticed by the whole community. Anyone can look to see whether a proposed law leans toward the advantage of one or a few citizens more than the rest or of the community, and can protest loudly in opposition. This would not be so, however, if the law were made by one or a few, attending more to their own private advantage rather than the common benefit, unquote. If every citizen considers a statutory proposal or prospective governor, and none finds any detriment to his own interests, then the decision merits promulgation, since it withstands the ultimate test of the common good as conceived by Marsiglio. Namely, can this measure harm me in any discernible way? Or will I instead derive some tangible benefit or at least no injury from it? When laws and officials are evaluated according to the principle of symmetrical determination of personal welfare, opportunities to manipulate public power tyrannically for personal gain are eliminated. As mentioned previously, Marsiglio portrayed tyranny as an illness. One may wonder whether the malady can be cured. The penultimate chapter of the first discourse of the Defensor Patres offers an affirmative answer. Marsiglio recognizes that the ruler, inasmuch as he is charged with enforcing the law over subjects who have in essence bound themselves to obey, occupies a special position. To the extent that he performs his duty in accordance with the law, and thus over voluntary subjects, he ought not to be susceptible to judgment on the part of those over whom he must exercise coercive power. Drawing on the physiological metaphors that he employs throughout the Defensor Patres, Marsiglio compares the ruler to the heart, which, quote, regulates and measures through its influence or action the other parts of the body in such manner that it is not regulated by them, nor does it receive any influence from them, unquote. But the analogy carries only so far. Quote, the ruler is human, Marsiglio reminds us, and therefore, quote, he has understanding and appetite, which can receive other forms like false opinion or perverted desire or both, on account of which he comes to act contrary to what is determined by the law, unquote. Without some authority capable of rendering legal judgment and correction, quote, every government would become despotic and the life of citizens slavish and insufficient. This is an evil to be avoided, unquote. Logically speaking, that source of discipline must be identical to the fount from which the ruling power and the law originally sprang, namely the body of citizens who conferred their consent. Marsiglio takes careful note of two practical considerations that must inform any process through which a ruler is corrected by the populace that chose him. First, a question arises as to the status of the person upon whom judgment is to be imposed. If he remains in a ruling position, quote, he and his action would be the measure of every civil act of men other than himself, in such manner that he would never be measured by others, unquote. Thus, were the body of citizens to judge him as such, quote, there would then be a plurality of governments in the community from which would result schism, agitation, and fighting, unquote. In the preceding chapter of the Defensor Paces, Marsiglio had just explained the dangers posed by overlapping and competing claims to jurisdictional supremacy. In the case of a governor whose conduct is adjudicated while simultaneously holding his position, precisely this threat to the public order would arise. Consequently, Marsiglio insists that any reproval applies to him not, quote, not as a ruler, but as a subject who has transgressed the law, unquote. Consequently, quote, it is well to suspend for some time the office of the ruler who is to be corrected, especially in relation to the person or persons who must judge his transgression, unquote. Pay special heed to this remark. It is the office itself that must be temporarily halted, not the incumbent. Otherwise, should the power inhering in the ruling position persist, the person to whom it has been assigned might continue to possess a valid claim to its exercise, in which case the scandal occasioned by conflicting jurisdictions remains. The second pragmatic factor in Marsiglio's analysis of institutional restraint on a ruler who has violated the law pertains to the nature of the offense. In particular, quote, someone might well wonder whether it is expedient that rulers, excuse me here, a couple pages stuck together. Let me go back, begin that quote again. Someone might well wonder whether it is expedient that rulers should be corrected for every kind of excess or only for some and not others, unquote. His reply is, in effect, it depends, according to the standards of gravity, frequency, and severity. Serious breaches of law demand harsh penalties. Minor violations may not require that the ruler be suspended and punished, quote, when no evident utility can emerge therefrom, but rather harm. Marsiglio's ultimate guideline appears to derive from the effect of the effort to keep government within the bounds of legality. Public office is executed by fallible human beings, after all. To demand too great a level of perfection on the part of magistrates actually sends the wrong message by undermining respect for the people charged with enforcing the law. Still, those who behave tyrannically, in the sense of demanding submission from subjects against their wills, as expressed by the legislation to which they have consented, can and should be corrected according to the law, Marsiglio says. Beyond these general rules of thumb, he seems unprepared to dictate inflexible precepts delineating when a government has crossed the line of conduct that serves the private advantage of those to whom the responsibility for enforcing law has been assigned. Even so, even though tyranny language is not front and center in Marsiglio Padua's Defensor Paces, the concepts associated with it prove to constitute essential elements in his theory. But a final lingering question begs for a response. Why didn't he simply step onto the path that Occam and others tread by accusing his papal foes of tyrannical conduct? Polemically, it would have been an easy route to pursue. Now, my best guess is that his distinction between well-tempered and infected regimes on the basis of the voluntary status of subjects simply did not apply to the situation of papal monarchy. Marsiglio advocated the idea that the General Council of the Church constitutes the supreme authority in spiritual matters. An ecclesiastical council was not, however, voluntary in the sense employed by him in the first discourse of the Defensor Pacis. Why? Because its decisions were not rendered with reference to the sufficient life conceived by reference to the material benefit. Rather, conciliar determinations about matters of faith and church governance, quote, receive their origin from the truth of the Holy Spirit, which manifests itself to the universal general council, guiding its deliberations and revealing the truth, unquote. According to the Defensor Pacis, temporal ends are for the most part indifferent to spiritual goals. The term spiritual, Marsiglio says, refers to every imminent action or passion of human cognitive or appetitive power, where imminent acts are understood as acts or passions that, quote, do not pass over into a subject other than the doer, nor are they exercised through any external organs or locomotive members. Of this kind are human thoughts and desires and affections, unquote. Because they are wholly internal and self-regarding, imminent acts are not susceptible to public inspection and control. They are spiritual in the sense that they do not transgress the boundaries of the soul and hence are invisible to human observation and are known only to God. By contrast, Marsiglio defines temporal matters in three possible senses. First, in connection with the physical world other than humankind, the objects of which, quote, are ordered toward human use, needs, pleasures, in and for the status of the worldly life, unquote. Second, as denoting, quote, every human habit, action, or passion, whether in oneself or directed toward another for a purpose in this world or the present life, unquote. And third, and most narrowly, as stemming from, quote, those human actions and passions which are voluntary and transient, resulting in advantage or disadvantage to someone other than the agent. The temporal activities of human beings, Marsiglio believes, are only of concern to someone else to the extent that they are transient, that is, have an impact on others. Consequently, transient acts, other regarding might be the modern equivalent, are the proper object of regulation by the political community. When transient behavior is performed in due proportion, it results in benefits to others as well as to oneself. When transient action is excessive, however, it disadvantages another person or people. As we have seen, this forms the very reason why it is necessary to create earthly government and law consonant with a voluntary populace. Since tyranny pertains to the absence of public consent and to temporal governance and statutes, it has no direct relevance to the spiritual purposes of the church. It simply makes no sense to call the Pope a tyrant, since by Marsiglio's own definition, tyranny is a category relevant only to worldly affairs. To proclaim the Pope a heretic, as Marsiglio does repeatedly, is quite different, insofar as that is a spiritual offense whose judgment and condemnation pertains to the General Council as the final arbiter in such matters. Thus, I think his concept of, and just to conclude here, that his concept of tyranny has a very specific and I think theoretically self-conscious application, and that the opportunity to use the nomenclature or to use the rhetoric of tyranny to attack the papacy, on the one hand, might have been attractive to Marsiglio in significant ways. It nevertheless would have been inconsistent with the theoretical model that he lays out. So tyranny has a much clearer specification conceptually, I think, in his thought than has been at least recognized by me, and indeed previously, and indeed by anyone else who I have been able to track down. All right, well, that basically does it for me, and I'm more than happy to have comments, questions, conversation to hopefully to improve the work. So I will turn it back to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. And I open the floor for discussion. Any questions or comments, remarks? Christopher Joyce.
Thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentation. It was hugely informative. I just have one observation here,
Yep.
and I'm fascinated by what you say about Marsiglio's understanding of tyranny in terms of the absence of public consent. And I just want to sort of go back to a passage in Aristotle's Politics. You talked about Aristotle at various points, but there's one very interesting point at Politics 4, 1292a. This is in book 4, round about sort of line 20 or so. It's where he talks about
1292a. You said?
Yeah, 1292a. This is in fact where he's talking about different categories of democracy, but he talks about the final category of democracy, heteliotia demokratia, which descends into a form of tyranny, and is very interesting the way that he classifies this, because he talks about it in terms of the absence of the rule of law. And he even says people of this sort, as being monarchs, seeks to exercise monarchic rule through not being ruled by the law, and becomes despotic so that flatterers are held in honor. And a democracy of this kind is comparable to the tyrannical form of monarchy, because the spirit is the same, and both exercise despotic control over the better classes. Of course, he understands this in sociopolitical language at this point. But I'm very interested here because what one can see in the speeches of Aeschines as well, the way that sort of true democracy and tyranny are contrasted. One is about the rule of law, and the other one is about the absence of the rule of law. And what again, I'm not familiar with the work of Marsiglio, but I was wondering how this feeds into the discussion that Marsiglio has of tyranny. Does he understand it in terms of the absence of the rule of law? Because I think at one point you said that somebody can become a tyrant if they issue a law that is not in the interest of the people. How does this feed into a rule of law framework? Over to you.
Okay, there's a lot in that question. This is actually a passage that Marsiglio does cite, but as he so often does, cites it in a way that doesn't actually capture accurately what Aristotle says. This is a constant practice of his, is to cite Aristotelian texts either by paraphrase or by misquotation. In Marsiglio's argument, however, and to be clear, he's not advocating for democracy, at least not explicitly. He regards democracy as one of the diseased constitutions, alongside tyranny and oligarchy. But in his view, it's necessary, it's necessary for law to have to be binding, to be obligatory, to have this generalized and popular consent, precisely because he thinks that any body, any group, any individual who is permitted to make law separate from the consent of the whole. In other words, who's able to impose law on whatever grounds. Again, it could be moral superiority, spiritual superiority, any grounds whatsoever, is inherently going to use that power, inescapably is going to use that power to aggrandize themselves. That human beings are given an opportunity to legislate, or for that matter, given the opportunity to enforce law without having any possibility of a check on them, will use that position to their own advantage. So it's an argument that works in terms of its logic, works very differently than the Aristotelian Aristotelian way of thinking about it. And that's why he has to insist that tyranny is in fact not only monarchic rule, again, Aristotle, right, who says it's monarchic rule of not for the common benefit, but it has to be monarchic rule. It's not for the common benefit on account of the fact that it's exercised over unwilling subjects, i.e. people who have not consented to the law or to the individual who is enforcing or claims to be enforcing the law, because law has to be a matter of consent, has to be consensual. So the way in which the argument works in Marsiglio is very different than what Aristotle is saying there, and is saying in that passage. And it seems to me precisely because even though people sometimes want to turn Marsiglio into a Democrat, he's not. I mean, he's something else. And indeed, my former doctoral student, Mary Beth Sullivan, published an article in the Medieval Studies Journal of the Ator a few years back, in which she demonstrated that Marsiglio does, in fact, in certain passages, especially in the 12th and 13th chapters of the first discourse, is to take over the arguments that Aristotle presents in favor of democracy, and use them to support his own position on consent, right? But these, of course, exactly the arguments that Aristotle, then having presented, knocks down. So, again, an example of how Marsiglio manipulates the text. Now, does that mean he's a Democrat? Mary Beth thought so. I'm not sure. I think there is more. The historian of medieval political thought, Jim Blythe, once called this a theory of meta-government. In other words, that regardless of constitutional form, and he's not interested in. I mean, he says explicitly that he's not interested in saying which constitution is better, right? Or amongst, say, the well-tempered constitutions, but that rather what he has is sort of underlying any constitutional form that he considers to be well-tempered. There have to be these mechanisms in place. So it's not as Aristotle understands democracy, and as Marsiglio at least claims to understand democracy. Democracy isn't. Democracy is not a good or a just constitutional system, but a lot of the mechanisms that he introduces to justify whatever system of government he finds acceptable have what we would think of as democratic overtones or democratic implications. I know it's a very long answer to your question, and I'm not sure if it helped a lot. Christopher, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Thank you very much. It's excellent. Just to add one little point here, that it's also worth pointing out that Aristotle, when he talks about these different typologies, is not rigid about the way that he does it. I mean, these typologies do flow in and out of each other, and I think you make a very, very important point that you've got the good types and the bad types in Aristotle. That yes, democracy chalks a pretty low second by comparison with, the best type of monarchy, I suppose, but he does recognise that there is a sliding scale, and that this sliding scale that they sort of go back in and out of one another. So it is not so much about which typology as the application of that particular type of the typology in accordance with lawful government or not. Right.
And this is it was a passage I quoted in my talk, where Marsiglio acknowledges that in Aristotle, right? Acknowledges that Aristotle has not merely just these the sixfold classification, but then that there's a lot of diversity within each of those categories, and then says, but I'm not interested in that. I mean, he actually just comes out and says that that's not that you can debate those different subcategories and so forth, but he says, I'm just not interested. He said it was that passage where he says that it's these matters are the kinds about which there can be reasonable doubt, I think is the phrase he uses.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So there is a part to his argument which maybe could be described as negative, in the sense that the mechanism he's describing serves as a sort of a negative mechanism defending from certain unwanted outcomes. And so I was just wondering how, because it sounded to me almost Augustinian in the sense his emphasis on the sort of corruption of human nature. So when Marsiglio says that you can't trust anyone to be a legislator because inevitably people are interested in their own sort of selfish benefit. So maybe this is not the language that Augustine uses, but do you think does he refer consciously to the city of God in any way? Because, well, Augustine is talking rather about the libido dominandi, this desire to dominate others. And Augustine also uses this kind of negative argument, saying that, the government is to restrict certain tendencies of fallen humanity. And it seems that to a certain point, Marsiglio is going into this direction, although then he offers a more positive argument as well. But I just wanted to ask you about his relationship to Augustine and Augustinian tradition.
Yeah, well, he has certainly been, there's certainly one line of interpretation that puts him within a kind of Augustinian, within an Augustinian framework. And he actually, I wrote a little article a number of years back on his actual uses of Augustine. I mean, in terms of citations, and they're surprisingly few, and they don't come from the City of God. They primarily come from Augustine's biblical commentary, I believe, and from I think sermon. This has been quite a while since I wrote this thing, so I'm going from long memory here. But this City of God, I'm trying to think. I'm not even sure City of God is cited once in the Defensa Patris. I'd have to go back and check that. But I know that the preponderance of Augustinian citations are to what we would think of perhaps as Augustine's more minor writings. The difference, though, is precisely the one you mentioned, which is, first of all, there's no distinction such as one gets in St. Augustine. And I'm in the middle of grading papers on St. Augustine at the moment, so he's much in the forefront of my mind. But the distinction that one finds between the saved, between the few, the chosen few, the graced few, and the damned many, his theory of human nature, that is, say, Marsiglio's theory of human nature, is that these qualities of self-interestedness, one, pertain to everybody. It's not as though there are a few lambs out there who are God's just chosen. And the second the second thing is that he simply makes no moral judgment whatsoever about this self-interested quality of human nature. I mean, he simply thinks that this is first of all, this is a matter of fact, and second of all, it is what we share with animals. And now remember, this guy is trained in medicine, and he uses the analogy between human beings and human beings and animals in terms of their desire for their innate desire for self-preservation, but all over the place. And none of that, or little of that Aristotelian moral language crops up. I mean, there's a passage in which he basically says, yeah, Aristotle said that the civil community exists for the sake of comes together for the sake of living, but continues to exist for the sake of living well, by which he means the exercise of virtue, of moral and of the moral and theoretical, the practical and theoretical virtues. But we're not going to talk about that. Because what's important is living. And then that's the whole conversation. This is recurrent references you heard from some of the quotes to the sufficient life, and by the sufficient life he means the physically sufficient life, and never goes on and talks about, as medieval Aristotelians generally would, about the living well part, about the exercise of the virtues. It just drops out, and so to that extent, he has the Augustinian elements, as you mentioned, of the libido dominandi, but in such a way as to say, well, and that is simply human nature in general, and it has nothing at all to do with matters of salvation.
So, but is he just not in? Well, is it that his political theory has those two tiers? So one is sufficient life, and there is supposedly a higher tier for the exercise of virtue, but he doesn't have time to write about this, or because his spiritual. You were talking about the spiritual dimension, but he thinks it's, and very curiously so, he says it has nothing to do with actual human relations. It's purely inward, which is an insane idea, of course. But is there anything in between for him? I mean, the virtuous life in a community, like for Aristotle, or he just thinks it doesn't exist?
He pays lip service to it, like I said. There's this one little passage. Hold on for a second. I just happen to have all my relevant books here. Let me just see if I can find quickly that passage that I was referring to in the Defensor Patris, because let me just read this if you don't mind. This is in Goworth's translation. I'm not going to try to cite translated from Latin. The state, according to Aristotle in Politics, Book 1, Chapter 1, is, quote, the perfect community having the full limit of self-sufficiency, which came into existence for the sake of living, but exists for the sake of living well, right? Standard Aristotle. This phrase, came into existence for the sake of living, but existing for the sake of living well, signifies the perfect final cause of the state. Since those who live a civil life not only live, which beasts or slaves do, but live well, having leisure for these liberal functions, which are in which are exercised the virtues of both the practical and theoretical soul. Sounds, you think, okay, well, this guy's going, straight down the Aristotelian path. Having thus determined that the end of the state to be living and living well, we must first treat of living and its modes. For this, as we have said, the purpose is the purpose for the sake of which the state has been established, and which necessitates all the things which exist in the state and are done by the association of men in it. Let us therefore lay down this principle. Let us lay down as the principle of all things which are to be demonstrated here, a principle naturally held, believed, and freely granted by all, that all men not, and I quoted this before, that all men not deformed or otherwise impeded naturally desire a sufficient life and avoid and flee what is harmful thereto. This has been acknowledged not only with regard to man, but with regard to every genus of animals. He then quotes Cicero in De Ficus, and off to the races we go. He then never comes back and talks about the virtues of the practical and the theoretic soul. That simply drops completely out of sight, and it's all sufficient life after that. It's all the living. So I mean, this is of course one of the ironies of people who have traditionally conceived him as as the quintessential Aristotelian, is that he's not very Aristotelian at all. And there's Augustinian element. Now, what I've actually argued is that there's, including in the chapter in the Bonds of Humanity book that you mentioned, what I've actually argued is that there's a great deal more Cicero in there ultimately in various ways than either, when you scratch the surface, than either Aristotle or, for that matter, St. Augustine. But I mean, he's just a very eclectic thinker. I mean, I don't think there's any way to, and hopefully people have stopped doing this, to sort of, classify him as he's this, he's that, he's something else, just on the basis of the sources he uses. And there's been some really good work done recently by a scholar who's now based in, who's split between University of Pennsylvania and where is it? In Venice, named Alessandro Mulieri, on Veroistic elements in his thought as well. And I'm convinced Alessandro is right that that's yet another dimension of his theory. So there's just it's a real sort of mixture of sources. And but I mean, I think you're right. I think Augustine is in the background there, but the issue in this
he seems to be using both Aristotle and Augustine for his own purposes. So, so he just takes certain the ways of thinking to a certain degree, but then he's sort of tries to transform those elements completely according to his own agenda.
And he's trying to. I mean, the other thing you have to keep in mind is the rhetorical dimension, is the audience he's speaking to. In the first discourse, which is said is just littered with citations to Aristotle, he's writing to his fellow scholastic philosophers. And the second discourse, Aristotle just basically disappears, and it all goes to using discourse like the spiritual Franciscan arguments. And a lot of theological citations, a lot of canon law citations. He basically takes anything he thinks he can use as an authority to convince the audience that he's writing to, and to the extent that that it was until I don't know 1940s, I guess it was. It was assumed that, in fact, the two different discourses had been written by two different authors. That Marsiglio had written the first one, and a colleague of his, John of Jandun, had written the second one. It turns out that's not the case, but in any case, the tone changes. The tone changes so much because he's, as I said, in the second discourse, which is on ecclesiology and conciliar theory, and it's a wholesale attack on the claims of papal power. His direction is very different. He moves in a very different direction. So he's he'll use any pretty much any source he can in order to to prop up what are essentially, in many cases, original points. And that's why I was so struck. And as I was saying at the beginning, I really appreciate the opportunity to go back and actually look at what he said about tyranny, because I was so struck by the fact that I expected the second discourse there was going to be plenty of tyranny language that I just hadn't paid any attention to applied to the Pope, and it's just not there, and which I think is another indication that he has a theoretical. That tyranny is doing some theoretical work for him there in such a way that it prohibits him from using T word to as a stick with which to beat the Pope.
Thank you. Does anyone else has a question or a comment? I wanted to ask you about one more thing, namely the sort of a positive part of his arguments. So the fact that everyone seems to be able to determine whether the law is good for me or not. I mean, so,
Right.
okay, so is he concerned in any way with the old Platonic, not Aristotelian, Platonic claim about the sort of a competence in political philosophy? I'm thinking about the ship image from the Republic. So who should be the steersman, basically, right? Someone who knows how to navigate. So for Plato, this is a very important part. I mean, competence, and of course, this is a typical argument against democracy. It's impossible that a majority is competent in anything. So is Marsiglio concerned with this in any way? I mean, he seems to believe that everyone is perfectly capable of assessing every law. This sounds very, very far-fetched.
Yes, indeed. He says repeatedly, he uses the phrase, no one knowingly harms himself. In other words, we are all competent judges in our own cases, and so the criteria are completely different. He says that there are a very few people who he calls deprived, or it can be it can be translated deprived or depraved, who are who will basically, who are sort of just the random jerk. I mean, people who won't go along with everybody else and aren't really using their best judgments. But he thinks those are rare and can be more or less. It's basically, we all know who these people are. We can ignore them because they're just always going to make trouble. Short of that, he thinks everybody is going to be able to judge what is in their own best interest. Because those interests are material interests. They don't have to have moral. They don't have to have moral competence or exercise moral judgment. And he takes this all the way down to all the people that Aristotle wants to keep out of qualification for citizenship. I mean, he's very clear that he's talking about anyone who makes a contribution, a functional contribution to the community. So that includes peasants, that includes artisans, it includes merchants, and he's quite straightforward about that. And so it's very extensive, and it goes exactly against sort of the Platonic, and for that matter Aristotelian idea that you need to have people who have, whether it's in Aristotle, leisure, or whether in Plato it's other kinds of conditions of life, in order to determine what's best for the community. What's best for the community is what's best for me and for everybody else who everybody else who has an interest in them, in the community, because we all because our ability to live a sufficient life requires us to live a communal existence. So, but it's for our own benefit, ultimately.
I saw Christopher Joyce was raising his hand. Come on, Christopher.
I have just one further question, actually, about something you said earlier on in your talk. So towards the beginning, you talked about the way in which Marsiglio was perceived in the 16th century, and I think you quoted somebody as saying that he was more Aristotelian than Christian. Right. And I'm fascinated by that, because and again, I ask this from ignorance, but in the later Middle Ages and going on into the early modern period, was Aristotelianism seen as being in some way unchristian or even anti-Christian? I mean, one of the reasons I ask this, of course, is that Aristotelian metaphysics is used in the 13th century by St. Thomas Aquinas to explain the mystery of the Eucharist, and that becomes a real sort of bone of contention in the 16th century at the time of the Reformation, because Luther adheres to the real presence, but he does not understand this in Thomistic language and thus in Aristotelian language. And to my understanding, the Eastern Orthodox equally, they have an understanding of the real presence, but not in this Aristotelian framework. And I was just wondering how the sort of 13th and 14th centuries understood Aristotle in relation to being a Christian. In other words, did they see Aristotelianism as pushing the boat out, finding a model of explanation that was seen as being risky? How was Aristotle perceived at that time?
Well, first, that quote that I read out was from a Counter-Reformation author who was accusing. Who was in the process of accusing Luther of being a Marsilian, of all things, given that irony, and that's from Marsiglio winds up being a during the Counter-Reformation, it winds up being sort of a whipping boy for. Basically, calling someone a Marsilian was to essentially accuse them of, in various ways, of being a heretic. And Marsilian himself was, in fact, condemned for heresy, but interestingly, not for the Aristotelian part at all. If you go and look at the condemnation, it's the papal condemnation. Of Marsiglio, his anathematization, it's all because of this use of materials from the spiritual Franciscan argument in the Second Discourse. The Aristotelianism isn't particularly controversial, and in general, of course, Aristotle, certainly by Marsiglio's time, and even far earlier, has become the basis for advanced education in the universities, in the schools. I mean, the arts faculties are essentially the whole curriculum of the arts faculties is Aristotelian. It's a matter of mastering Aristotle's writings, and of course, then you get these volumes and volumes of commentaries and questiones and so forth that are all produced in order to explicate that. And Aquinas is doing that in the Summa and elsewhere. And of course, Aquinas writes many commentaries himself on a variety of Aristotle's writings. So Aristotle is not, except in really two things, except in extreme circumstances, Aristotle's presence is not seen to be particularly dangerous. Certainly, it's been entirely integrated into the educational structure of the Middle Ages, and even when there are attempts like the 1277 condemnation of 219, I think it was, Aristotelian propositions by the Bishop of Paris. The universities are so so autonomous. They ignore it. It doesn't pose a problem for them. So even attempts to control Aristotelian teaching from the outside of the universities are very ineffective. Now, the other thing is that Aristotle's political and moral thought, in comparison with, say, some of his metaphysical ideas and conception of the soul and so forth, are surprisingly uncontroversial. They get taken up, and so when you do get condemnations or attempts to condemn Aristotelian propositions, very little of it is in reference to either the ethics or to the politics. They're just not. They're not seen to be particularly problematic, and there are various explanations for that. I mean, in part, a lot of the ideas that people have thought might be problematic or challenging, when Aristotle gets translated, his political naturalism, for example, turn out to be ideas that are, through other sources, Cicero again being an important one, through other sources are widely available and widely used, and are not particularly controversial. A lot of Aristotle's moral thought, in fact, is simply coincides with pre-existing ideas of about the virtues and about moral psychology and so forth. So Aristotle is, in that particular sphere, in the sphere of moral and political thought, Aristotle is not particularly, surprisingly, maybe not particularly controversial.
Yeah, I would add to that in the 13th century, there was some backlash against Aristotle in some of the church hierarchy, but this was like earlier in the 12th century. So there was this, like, in a discussion between Bernard de Clairvaux and Abelard. So what are the limits of human reason, basically? So Aristotelianism was a science which didn't need revelation, and for some it was a problem. And in the condemnation you mentioned by Stéphane Tompier, the Bishop of Paris, some claims, some propositions of Thomas Aquinas were condemned as heretical. So that's something we tend to forget, that Thomas Aquinas could be seen as controversial by some. But of course, his canonization and his promotion in the 14th century sort of changed the attitude. But I think you're right that what was controversial about Aristotle was epistemology. So the idea that human mind can know reality without any special help from God, that could be seen as controversial, but not political or moral philosophy.
Yeah. But even so, the Tompier condemnation and others, have no impact, right? Effectively, they have no impact because the University of Paris is a universitas. It's a self-governing corporation, and it doesn't have to answer to external authorities. The Bishop of Paris can't send his men in and engage in an inquisition because of the very nature of the institution of the university. And it's not just true. I mean, Paris obviously is the hotbed, but this is true, throughout Europe. Is any serious effort from without to control the curriculum, the university curriculum, and the doctrines that are taught at the university just have no discernible effect.
They could always go on strike.
I guess in essence.
I wanted to ask you one more thing, namely, is Marsiglio interested in any way in sort of, again, Platonic concept of tyranny as a sort of this inner psychological illness of an individual? Because he talks about health and illness of the whole state or constitution, but does he ever mention a tyrant as this Platonic perverted figure who is internally evil and sick, and or he doesn't use this at all?
No, I mean, the medical analogies are all in terms of constitutional the constitutional systems, the constitutional structures. He's very little interested in, well, as I said, he doesn't actually talk about tyranny all that much, surprisingly, but he's very little interested in matters having to do with personal characteristics in that sense. he's much more an institutionalist in that regard. And again, I think this ties into the fact that he thinks, at least in matters of temporal life, it's material rather than moral issues that are more fundamentally at stake. And but again, keep in mind, he doesn't have the Republic either. The Republic is not going to get translated into Latin until the 15th century. So he would not have much, if any, idea of Plato's views, but I don't think he'd be much interested in them.
Yes, but he could have access to it perhaps through Seneca or some Roman Stoics who, I mean, yeah, the idea that a tyrant is this completely corrupt, evil person, right? So it's of course it comes from Plato, but it's sort of then developed in Roman authors, both in philosophy and literature. So he could have access to it if he was interested in this. But the only psychological part that seems to lurk behind is the idea is that you can't give anyone unrestricted power, because they will be inevitably, out of self-interest, they will act against the interest of others, like that. So there is some psychology of tyranny, let's say, but a very limited one, it seems.
Yeah, and again, the psychology, the psychology behind tyranny plugs directly into the reason for his argument for the necessity of consent, for voluntary, for that rule must be exercised. A legitimate rule must be exercised over voluntary subjects, and because the consequences of having in his sense, non-voluntary subjects is that power is going to be used in a way to advance partial or private interests, and that's I mean, it's a I've got a book chapter coming out in a book on Marsiglio later this year, in which I make a quasi-plausible case that a lot of Marsiglio's concepts, in fact, have echoes, for want of a better phrase. I don't want to say anticipations, but have echoes of modern collective action problems, of modern rational choice theory. Precisely because a lot of the issues he takes up deal with things like rent seeking, for example, or free riding and so forth. I mean, it's the logic is is surprisingly redolent of the way in which my social science colleagues the sort of the categories that they use, the analysis they use, which I think I've always find sort of surprising.
Yeah, he does sound very modern in a way, and also kind of traditional in certain ways. But so you emphasize his originality. So you were referring to his use of the sources as I mean, he's original in the sense that he's not dependent on the sources in such a way as to just repeat the claims made previously, either by Cicero or Aristotle or Augustine or anyone, right? So, okay.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I just think he's extremely eclectic, and doesn't, for whatever reasons. I mean, he has his agenda, and he deploys his sources to support his agenda rather than concerning himself with sticking closely to his sources and reining himself in because of that.
Any other question or comments? Well, it's very interesting how your presentation played out together with Sylvain Piron's presentation on the spiritual Franciscans, and really, it's interesting to have those two perspectives from the similar time, very different ones, and and of course we have in mind what happened later in the 14th and 15th century as well. So that's a very good way to proceed. Okay, thank you very much for your lecture and for bringing to our attention this interesting thinker who sort of, as I said, he seems very modern at times, but he's of course fully the child of his own time and his own culture. On the other hand. Okay, so thank you very much, Harry, for this presentation. I thank you also. I thank the audience for being here and for participating in the discussion. So thank you. Have a good evening or have a good day in your
yes,
case.
Yeah, it's only 1:30 here. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. You're welcome. Bye-bye.